What if the door you thought was still cracked open, just slammed shut for good? Not quietly, not behind palace walls, but in full view of the world. Because this time, the message didn't come through whispers, leaks, or sources close to the situation. This time, it landed like a final stamp on royal letterhead. Clear, cold, and impossible to ignore. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. No more HRH. Not now. Not later. Not ever again. And the timing? That's what makes this explode. Because this isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening with the Invictus Games 2027 looming on the horizon. In the UK, on home soil, under global scrutiny, with cameras ready, veterans watching, and a monarchy that knows exactly how symbolism works. Here's the uncomfortable truth the palace doesn't say out loud. Titles aren't just words. They're power, their access, their authority. And for years, there's been an uneasy truce built around one fragile compromise. Harry and Meghan could keep their HRH styles, but they were not supposed to use them. So let me ask you something. If a rule exists but keeps getting tested, is it really a rule at all? Behind closed doors, patience was thinning. Advisors were warning. Courtiers were watching headlines stack up. Every appearance, every press cycle, every branding move raised the same quiet question. Where does private life end and royal identity begin? And then came Invictus, a global event rooted in service, sacrifice, and military honor. Founded by Harry himself, loved by the public, respected by veterans, and suddenly set to return to the UK, the very place where royal protocol isn't flexible, symbolic lines matter, and the crown does not share its spotlight easily. This wasn't just about a title anymore. It was about optics, control, and legacy. Because for King Charles, this chapter isn't just about his son. It's about how history will judge his reign. Weak king or decisive monarch. Sentimental father or guardian of the institution. And here's where it gets personal. Every royal family has conflicts, but most of them stay buried under tradition and silence. This one didn't. It unfolded on talk shows, in documentaries, in memoirs, in lawsuits, in moments that made reconciliation harder every single time. So when the palace finally spoke, not softly, not ambiguously, but clearly, it wasn't just a policy update. It was a verdict. And the most chilling part? According to those closest to the situation, this decision wasn't triggered by a single event. It was the end of a long countdown. One final moment where the crown decided it could no longer afford uncertainty. Because what happened just before this ban was issued forced a choice. And once that choice was made, there was no going back. Here's the part most people still don't understand. Prince Harry and Meghan were never stripped of their HRH titles in the dramatic way headlines like to suggest. On paper, the titles were left sitting there, untouched, almost like a loaded weapon locked in a drawer. Technically still yours, but you're warned never to take it out. And that distinction matters more than people realize. Because in royal culture, what you're allowed to keep versus what you're allowed to use is everything. The original exit agreement wasn't just a breakup. It was a ceasefire, a carefully worded compromise designed to stop the bleeding. Harry and Meghan would step back from royal duties. They would build independent lives. But the monarchy, eager to avoid a total rupture, allowed the HRH styles to remain, with one ironclad condition. They would never be used. Not commercially, not publicly, not symbolically. Why? Because HRH doesn't just signal birthright. It signals representation, authority, a kind of invisible stamp that says, I speak with the crown behind me. And once you leave the institution, you are not supposed to speak with its voice. So here's the contradiction that quietly haunted the palace for years. How do you stop someone from using a title they technically still possess? You rely on trust, on restraint, on the assumption that both sides want to avoid humiliation. But what happens when that trust erodes? Every appearance, every press cycle, every rebrand. Each one raised the same uneasy question inside palace walls. Are these two living private lives, or are they still borrowing royal gravity when it suits them? Think about it like this. Imagine leaving a powerful company, keeping the company badge, and being told, you can't swipe it anywhere. You're free to move on. But the moment that badge shows up in the wrong place, alarms start going off. And behind the scenes, alarms were going off. Courtiers began flagging concerns. Advisors warned about confusion, not just among the public, but among foreign institutions, sponsors, and media outlets who still blurred the line between personal brand and royal authority. Was it intentional? Was it careless? Or was it inevitable? That's where opinions inside the palace started to split. Some believed this was all misunderstanding and media exaggeration. Others believed something far more dangerous was happening. That the line between former royals and royals in exile was becoming impossible to define. And for a monarchy built on clarity and hierarchy, ambiguity is poison. King Charles, by nature, is patient, deliberate. He waits. He listens. He hopes situations cool rather than explode. But patience has a shelf life. And sources suggest that behind closed doors, one question kept resurfacing. How long can we allow this gray area to exist before it damages the crown itself? Because once Invictus 2027 entered the picture, that gray area suddenly turned very, very black and white. And that's when the palace realized the line hadn't just been tested. It had been crossed. But what truly forced King Charles's hand wasn't public opinion. It was what Invictus on UK soil would inevitably trigger. And that's where everything starts to unravel. Here's the uncomfortable question no one wanted to ask out loud. Why now? Why not years ago, when tensions were hotter? Why not right after the interviews, the documentaries, the memoirs? Why did this decision land with the Invictus Games 2027 staring everyone in the face? Because Invictus isn't just another event. It isn't a charity gala. It isn't a speaking tour. It's a symbol, a powerful one, built by Prince Harry, rooted in military sacrifice, wrapped in national pride. And when it returns to the UK, it doesn't just belong to Harry anymore. It belongs to the country. And that's where the monarchy's alarm bells started screaming. On British soil, nothing royal adjacent is neutral. Every handshake becomes a statement. Every seating arrangement sends a message. Every title used or not used gets decoded by the press, by diplomats, by veterans, by the public. Now imagine this scenario from the palace's point of view. Prince Harry, founder of Invictus, returns to the UK. Cameras follow him. Crowds cheer. Veterans salute. And hovering over every headline is the same loaded question. Is he here as a private citizen, or as something more? Because if HRH even appears to be in play, the optics spiral out of control. The palace worried about mixed signals. Foreign delegations assuming royal backing. Sponsors implying royal endorsement. Media framing Invictus as a royal event rather than an independent foundation. And once that confusion sets in, it's almost impossible to undo. For King Charles, this wasn't theoretical. This was reputational math. He had advisors warning him that allowing ambiguity during a UK-hosted Invictus Games would blur constitutional lines the monarchy has spent centuries defending. That the crown could appear to be quietly endorsing figures it no longer controls. That silence would be read as consent. And silence, in this case, was the most dangerous option. There's also the emotional layer no one wants to talk about. Invictus is Harry's pride. His proof of purpose after leaving royal life. The one project no one could ever take away from him. Bringing it back to the UK wasn't just logistical, it was symbolic. A return. A test. A moment that would force everyone to confront what Harry still is and what he no longer is. For the palace, that made Invictus a fault line. Not because they opposed the games. Quite the opposite. But because the event magnifies everything. Love, loyalty, resentment, power, titles. And then there's Meghan. Meghan Markle doesn't have a military role in Invictus, but her presence changes the narrative instantly. Cameras widen, headlines sharpen, and every appearance becomes a referendum on the past 8 years of royal turmoil. Could the monarchy afford that kind of chaos on home ground? According to insiders, the answer was no. So the decision hardened. Not quietly, not later, but now, before tickets sold, before schedules locked, before anyone could claim confusion. Because once Invictus arrives in the UK, there can be no doubt about who represents the crown and who does not. And that's when King Charles made a choice that shocked even seasoned courtiers. Not just to enforce the rule, but to make it unmistakably public. But the way that message was delivered sent a signal far deeper than protocol. And that signal was meant for one person above all others. Here's what made this moment different from every other royal fallout before it. Royal discipline is usually silent. A door quietly closed. An invitation that never comes. A diary entry that mysteriously stays blank. But this time, the palace didn't whisper. It spoke. And when the monarchy speaks publicly, it's never just about what's being said. It's about who it's being said to. King Charles III understood something his critics often overlook. In a media environment fueled by speculation, ambiguity becomes a weapon turned against the crown. Every gap in clarity gets filled by rumor. Every pause gets interpreted as weakness. So instead of letting interpretation spiral during Invictus 2027, the palace chose finality. No HRH use. No exceptions. No future reconsideration. And here's the part that cuts deepest. This wasn't framed as punishment. It was framed as definition. A line drawn not in anger, but in ink. Behind closed doors, sources say the tone was measured. Almost surgical. No shouting. No dramatics. Just a cold acknowledgement that the hybrid status Harry and Meghan once occupied could no longer exist. You are either in the institution, or you are not. And for a king obsessed with legacy, that distinction matters more than feelings. But let's be honest. This wasn't just a constitutional decision. It was a personal one. Because when a father makes a ruling that affects his son this publicly, something else is happening beneath the surface. A recognition that reconciliation, at least for now, cannot coexist with institutional stability. Ask yourself this. Would a private warning have worked? Insiders suggest there were already private warnings. Gentle ones, then firmer ones. Each time hoping restraint would prevail. Each time watching the gray zone stretch a little further. Until the monarchy decided the gray zone was more dangerous than the backlash. And backlash was guaranteed. Harry, once the most popular royal, now faced with a message that stripped away the last symbolic thread tying him to the crown's authority. Meghan, long positioned as the disruptor, now permanently outside the boundary she was accused of challenging. The public ban wasn't meant to humiliate. It was meant to stop the story from rewriting itself. Because without clarity, the Invictus Games risked becoming something else entirely. Not a celebration of wounded warriors, but a referendum on royal power, grievance, and unresolved family war. King Charles didn't want that fight on British soil. So he made the choice no monarch ever wants to make. He chose the crown over the possibility of quiet reconciliation, order over ambiguity, permanence over hope. And yet, for all its firmness, this decision carries an eerie silence at its core. Because if this is truly the final verdict, then something far more unsettling follows. What happens when Prince Harry returns to the UK not as a royal, not as a representative, but as a man standing entirely on his own legacy? And more importantly, how does the public respond when the crown makes it unmistakably clear that the door behind him is no longer open? Because the next chapter isn't about titles anymore. It's about consequences. So here we are. The door didn't just close. It locked, and the key was put somewhere no one can reach. When this story began, it felt like another chapter in a long, messy family dispute. Titles, protocol, hurt feelings. But now, standing at the end of it, the truth is sharper and far more uncomfortable. This was never just about HRH. It was about identity. For Prince Harry, the loss isn't ceremonial. It's existential. Because HRH wasn't just a style. It was the final thread connecting who he was born as with who he chose to become. And once that thread is cut, there's no weaving it back together. Think about the weight of that. Returning to the UK. Walking streets where every brick remembers you. Attending an event you built with your own hands. But doing so without the invisible shield of royal authority. No protection from interpretation. No buffer from criticism. No ambiguity left to hide behind. For Meghan, the verdict lands differently, but no less heavily. This decision freezes the narrative in place. No more speculation about half in, half out. No more debates about future reinstatement. The line has been drawn in a way that history tends to remember. And for King Charles, this moment may define his reign more than any coronation speech ever could. Because this wasn't a move driven by popularity. It was driven by control, by fear of chaos, by the belief that a monarchy survives not by bending endlessly, but by choosing when not to bend at all. Here's the contradiction that lingers. By enforcing this ban publicly, the crown gained clarity, but lost softness. It secured authority, but at the cost of warmth. And while institutions survive on rules, families survive on forgiveness. Can those two ever truly coexist? That's the question hanging in the air as Invictus 2027 approaches. Because the cameras will roll, the crowds will cheer, the veterans will march, and somewhere in that moment, the world will see Prince Harry exactly as the monarchy has now defined him. Not as a royal prince, not as a representative of the crown, but as a man standing entirely on the strength of his own legacy. No titles to lean on, no institutional shield, just the work he built and the consequences that came with it. So I'll leave you with this. Was this ban necessary to protect the monarchy? Or did it mark the moment the family fracture became irreversible? And when history looks back on this decision, will it see a king who acted decisively? Or a father who chose the crown when reconciliation still flickered in the distance? Let me know what you think. Was this the right call or the final mistake? Because the next time Harry steps on a British soil, the world won't just be watching him. They'll be watching the monarchy itself.